If you would, go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 18. Matthew chapter 18. Thank you so much for everyone who is here this evening. Matthew chapter 18, and we'll start reading in verse 1. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And calling to him a child, he put him in the midst of them. And he said, "Truly, I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." For a long time with this verse, I felt like I didn't quite get it. If you've ever met me, I imagine a word that would not come to your mind is fatherly. Kids are not things people trust me with. And so, for a long time, I don't really know a lot about kids. However, my brothers have started this very annoying habit where they have children. It has plummeted me down the favorite son totem pole. However, this past Christmas, I saw something that maybe some of you can identify, and it really kind of helped me understand this verse. I've got this nephew, and he's pretty small, 2 or 3. I have no clue how old children are. They all look the same, but he's probably about 2 or 3. And he got this truck for Christmas. And if you've met him, you know the one thing about him, he loves trucks. Anything with 4 wheels that can move dirt, he's obsessed with it. And he got this truck, and it was all he wanted. He's playing with it constantly. It's all he wanted. He didn't pay attention to anyone else. And my brother, his dad, is talking to him like, "Hey, you need to open your other presents." Or, "Hey, you got to go tell people thank you. Go make sure you thank everyone." He didn't care. He had the one thing he wanted. And all he wanted was just to sit there and play with that truck. And so a few minutes later, we're all, the adults are sitting there hanging out, talking. And then you notice you don't hear the same noises anymore. And so we look over, and my heart breaks. You see this little kid, and he's holding in his hands that little toy truck. One of the wheels popped off. And in his entire world, it's over. It's ended. The one thing he held closest and dearest, all that he had, all that he could go off of, ruined. And so he comes up to my brother, which is funny because those of you that were been to Gardendale long enough to know Ryan Baker, you would not trust him to fix anything. He took it to him, and he just held it out. He just said, "Fix it." And he did. It wasn't a big deal. It was just a little wheel. He just popped it right back on. And looking at this passage, when Jesus says the greatest in the kingdom is like he who comes to him like a child, I realize that each and every one of us here that has been baptized in Christ, that we've become an entirely new creation at some point in our lives, we were just like my nephew. We had our broken life in our hands, and we walked up to Jesus, we walked up to God, and we said, "Fix it." We recognized that God was the only one that could fix it, that no one else could possibly fix that which was broken. And so what we've done here, what Christianity is all about, is each and every one of us here had a broken life, and we said, "God, not my will, but yours be done." And so we've given our life to God, and we're doing what he says now. Now we examine things in our lives, and we try to make sure that whatever we're doing, it's not our will, but it's his. I give this extended introduction because the topic I have for tonight is not one that is exciting to talk about. The only reason I'm talking about it is because Shackelford told me I had to give this sermon and then conveniently left so that he doesn't have to be here to pick up the pieces. Tonight I'm going to be talking about biblical modesty. Modesty is a hard topic that many of you probably have some uncomfortable interactions with. We all probably have stories of where we invited someone to church that maybe didn't go to church a lot, and maybe he or she just didn't quite dress the same as everyone else, and then there was some uncomfortable interaction, and that person never came into a church again. Or maybe we have these uncomfortable stories where we've had Bible studies or things where we just weren't happy with the way things were taught or the way things were addressed. And so what I'd like to do tonight is to try and look at what the Bible says, to try and make sure that each and every one of us here, we are truly giving our life to Christ. We are examining and making sure that the decisions we're making, they're not our own, that we're making the decisions that Christ would make when he fixes the broken life that we gave him. First of all, I think a lot of times when we teach modesty, we do it a disservice. If I were to get up and I'd do a sermon on, say, lying, I'd say, well, the Christian cannot lie. God is a God of truth. There is no lying in him. And if you want to be a servant of God, you can't lie. Or if we involve murder, something like that, we'd say, you can't take another life. Life only belongs to God. If you want to be a creation of God, if you want to be in his kingdom, you can't do these things. But yet a lot of times when we talk about modesty, the focus leaves God. We look and we say, look, modesty is all about how you interact with others. Yeah, modesty, you got to make sure you don't make other people lust. And I think that when we focus so much on that, we can cause problems because we've taken the focus off of God. I saw a post one time on the internet. It was by a woman I didn't know. But she said she wishes that when she was young, that when she had been taught modesty, the focus hadn't been on how the way she dressed interacted with other men. Because when she was taught that, it started to create animosity between her and the men. Why do I have to change how I act just to protect them? Why can't they be stronger? She wishes that the focus had instead been to teach her that she was a daughter of Christ. And that as a daughter of Christ, there's a way you have to present yourself. There's a way you have to act, you have to dress, you have to speak. And if you want to be a daughter of Christ, you have to make sure you keep track of all of those things. And so when we teach modesty, we got to make sure that we're keeping God as the most important part. We have 2 verses in the New Testament we usually turn to for modesty. We're going to read those back to back. Turn to 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 3. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. Now turn on over to 1 Timothy chapter 2. 1 Timothy chapter 2, starting in verse 8. I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Likewise also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness, with good works. These are the 2 main verses we go to talk about modesty. And you know one word that we didn't see in there? Lust wasn't talked about. When teaching modesty, the most important thing when they were writing, Peter and Paul were writing these things, it wasn't how it interacted with other people. He said, first and foremost, are you professing godliness? Is the way you're dressing, is it showing to people that you have a new creator? Something I found, I occasionally preach over at Sugar Creek, where my parents now attend. And Sugar Creek, they're not young. Something I found a lot, whenever I do a good job, no one ever says, wow, Nolan, you did a good job. They say, your parents must be proud. Or, oh, you must have been raised right. Whenever I do a good job, no one's like, wow, Nolan, I bet you worked really hard on that. No, they say, your parents are great. My parents get all the credit for anything good I do because they know them better and not me. Well, likewise, what's important in the way we dress, when we're putting on God, when we're adorning ourselves with good works, we're trying to heap that praise back on our Father. We're trying to have people look at us and say, your Father must be proud of you. Your Father raised you right. What a good sign, it's such a good sign when your kids act right, and then all of a sudden, people appreciate how good their parents must be. We have an opportunity to do that with how we dress. And that's, I think, at the basis of modesty. I'd also like to point out that modesty is separate from lust. Every time we teach modesty, we try and point out, well, modesty is a matter of how much of yourself you can cover. Modesty, it's important. You got to make sure that no one's lusting. You got to cover as much skin as possible because that's what modesty is. Again, when we look at these 2 verses, that wasn't all that was a part of modesty. It also has to do with how you try and show off how fancy you are. If I try and wear the nicest suit or the nicest tie I can, just so that you think, wow, Nolan must make good money. He must have a good job because of how he dresses. Maybe the car he drives, I bet he worked hard for that. All these things people can look at. Are we heaping praise on ourselves or are we praising our God? Just to let you know, This suit, my grandmother bought it for me. The socks and shoes I'm wearing, my mom got for me. Everything I have is only because of my parents, only because of my family. And so likewise, with the way we dress, with the way we act and interact with people, how much does it say about our God, about our Holy Father, by what we adorn ourselves with? The base word modesty, whenever we use it outside of a sermon, it refers to a lack of pride. Becky Burke, I think, is the best cook in the building. I think we all agree on that. If I were to go up to her at a potluck and I were to say, this is really good, this is great, you did a good job, and she might say something like, oh, I just threw some stuff together. What would I say to her? Don't be modest. I'm trying to heap praises on her for this great thing she's made, and she's like, oh, no, don't do that. Someone's being modest if they don't want to accept praise or honor. And so likewise, modesty, we have to realize, don't heap praise on yourself. What's important isn't how attractive you are. It's how great your Lord is. What's important isn't how much money you make. It's how you present yourself and how rich you are in the kingdom that is above. So I'd like to give you an analogy. Let's say that after this, I walked outside, walked down Main Street, wearing exactly what I'm wearing now. Fully covered. You can see my hands and my face, but that's it. And I were to see a guy that's out for a jog. And it's one of those guys, I'm sure we've seen him. He's completely shirtless except for AirPods. And he's wearing those really short shorts that we see, people, apparently it's the only thing you can wear to run in. If I were to see that man, and I walk out of church dressed like this, and I look at him and say, of course he didn't go to church. Look at the way he dresses. You know what? I'm not even going to try and talk to God about him because clearly he's made up his mind. He doesn't care. He's just showing off his body to the world. Out of the two of us, who is more modest? Is it the man who just put on what he's always put on and went out for a jog? Or is it me, who's now used my ability to cover myself as a stumbling block? Now, because I can cover more skin than him, I think I'm a better person than him. I think that I'm more worthy of church and the kingdom than he'll ever be. I think a lot of times when we teach people, really all we want to focus on is whether or not you can cover more of yourself. But you have to realize this can become a stumbling block, and it did for the Pharisees. In Matthew chapter 23, the 7 woes to the Pharisees, one of them, he says to them, oh, woe to you Pharisees, for you make your phylacteries broad and your tassels long. They had these articles of clothing that were supposed to remind them of God. They had this thing on their forehead that was supposed to show off, look, I'm always thinking about Scripture. And they had these things on the edges of their clothes that were supposed to get in their way, and it was supposed to remind them always of the covenant of God. They took those things and they used them as opportunities to make other people feel bad about themselves. He said, woe to you Pharisees, for you wear these things not to be seen by God, but to be seen by men. And so likewise, I think a lot of times I can dress like this. I can go outside and I can be guilty of the same thing the Pharisees are guilty of. I can become more immodest than the people of this world because I start using my ability to cover myself, my ability to put on church clothes, and now I think I'm the only one worthy of heaven. I'm doing the same thing that the Pharisees did, and I become more immodest because of it. How about think of the Amish? I think, if we were to ask you who's the most modest person you can think of, the Amish would probably be the group that comes to mind. However, I think the Amish are doing a very similar thing to what the Pharisees are doing. The Amish have these strict rules about what colors they can wear, about how many buttons can be on their clothing, about where the creases are supposed to be. And if you want to join them, if you want to go in with them and worship with them, you have to follow those rules. They won't let anyone come in and worship with them unless they're following those rules. Just like the Pharisees, I think their ability to cover themselves can become immodest. What are you professing with the way you dress? Are you trying to show people just how much better you are than them? Are you judging people because of their inability to cover themselves just because they haven't been taught better yet? Or do you see people that need God? Do you see people that, just like you, at one point, they just did whatever felt right? They made decisions that seemed obvious to them because what else would they do? And until they were shown God, they were shown His message, they didn't know any better. How are we treating people? I think modesty is one of those things that a lot of us, we're pretty good at it, and so that means we use it as a way to judge people that aren't. If someone's struggling with alcohol, We don't just say, oh, well, I've never struggled with alcohol. You must be terrible. We try to help that person, try and lift them up and try and understand. But yet sometimes because we can dress up and play church, we see these people that don't put on a lot of clothes, and we try and say, you just don't know any better. You're just a dummy. Are we using the way that we dress? Are we looking to help people? Or are we just using it to judge people? Are we treating people like the Pharisees? A lot of times, I think in modesty sermons or in Bible classes, there's a temptation to overemphasize the physical. We want to make sure that people look the way we want them to look in church. And so sometimes when people visit church, the most important thing to us, if they're not dressed the way we think they should be, is that's what we want to bring up. These people that we've never even met before, they're visitors, and yet the first thing we want to talk to them about is say, hi, my name's Nolan. You should really think about dressing up a little bit more for church. You probably shouldn't show that much skin if you want to worship with us. Do you realize in doing that, you don't even know the state of their heart? You're trying to get people to dress up and look like Christians without even figuring out if they know who Christ is. You're trying to make people dress up and play church when inside they might be physically dead or spiritually dead. My grandfather has this fun quote. He used to raise chickens, and he likes to say, you can put a doily on chicken poop, but it's still going to stink. I think a lot of times we try and do that with people. We try and make sure that on the outside they look the way we expect a Christian to look. And we've ignored the weightier matters of the law. We've forgotten that what truly disgraces a person, what truly makes them unclean, it's not what's on the outside, but it's what comes from within. Make sure that we're focusing on the heart. Because when you show people who Christ is, when you show people how Christ has changed your life, then I think they'll start to see. They'll start to recognize that there's a way that a son or a daughter of Christ should dress. What's most important is that we're here to save souls. And we're not here to just make sure people look like Christians. We're here to convert Christians. Immodesty comes from within. We have to recognize that whenever we see people struggling with these things, we have to try and change the heart. That's what's most important. We're here to change the heart. In a lot of ways, beauty is very similar to wealth. We see people on this earth, they do a lot of work to amass wealth. They want it, they do everything they can to get it, and once they have it, they just keep trying to get more and more. I think beauty can be pretty similar in that way. There are some people that are more attractive than others. That's just the way the world works. However, those people, you now have a temptation. Just like when we look at the people that are wealthy and we'd say there's a temptation there, not to hoard it, but to give it out freely. With beauty, there's a temptation to hoard it. There's a temptation to do nothing but focus on ways that you can become more and more attractive. Make sure all you do is work out, and all you do is buy all these different items to try and make sure you're as pretty as all the people you see on the news, all the people you see on television. Be careful we're not trying to hoard these things that God has given us. Make sure that we're always focused on what's truly important. If you would, turn over to 2 Timothy chapter 2. Second Timothy chapter 2, starting in verse 20. Now in a great house there are not only vessels of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay, some for honorable use, some for dishonorable. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from what is dishonorable, he will be a vessel for honorable use, set apart as holy and useful to the master of the house, ready for every good work. If all we care about is trying to heap praises on ourselves, if it's making sure we've got this workout Instagram so that everyone comes up and says, wow, I can really tell you work out all the time. Can you give me some tips? Or all we do is make sure we've got all the latest beauty products. If we dress in a way that makes sure people know just how attractive you are by making sure there's nothing left to the imagination, are you a vessel in God's house? You have to cleanse these things from within you, cleanse the dishonorable so that then God can use you. If all you care about is making sure people know how good you look, if people know how great and wealthy you are, God can't use you. It's not until you cleanse that which is dishonorable that you become a vessel in God's house. and God can use you to grow the kingdom. Make sure that in the way we dress, we adorn ourselves with good works. We're always focused on ways we can help others and do good things for people. We don't want the first thing people to say about us is something about our appearance. That may be true for some of you. I cannot imagine. But maybe, just maybe, it's more important what people think about God. Make sure that when you interact with people, you're highlighting who your God is and what He's done for you. We have the classic relationship whenever you have a talk about modesty, the luster and the lusted for. I really wanted to do luster and lusty, but David Short would probably tell me that's not a real word. From the point of the luster, we need to make sure we always tell lust is a sin. Anything outside of marriage, lust is a sin. Lots of times we try and excuse lust in its various forms. I've even heard mothers of Christians try and defend their sons by saying, well, did you see what she was wearing? He didn't stand a chance. We try and defend lust amongst our own members, and we try and put the blame anywhere but ourselves. Well, I want to tell you, lust is a sin. No matter what the circumstances are, lust is a sin, and you are guilty for your own sins. I don't say that to try and diminish any of you that struggle with lust. Lust is a hard thing to overcome, and I'm sure many people in this building probably struggle or have struggled with it before. Lust is something where you quit trying to treat people like they're creations of God, and now you just use them for your own purposes. You just look at them for what you want and not for what God wants for them. And so if you struggle with lust, it's not easy, and it's going to take a lot of work to overcome that. But it cannot be excused. Lust is a sin in every form. For the one that is lusted for, the lusty, there is a right way to dress in the eyes of God. If hypothetically, I walked outside, walked down Main Street, and I took off all of my clothes, I tell you, no one would lust. It just wouldn't happen. I've still sinned. Our sin is not based on whether or not we've caused someone to lust. Our sin is based on whether we have professed God. And so there's ways that we can present ourselves to the world that make God happy or upset. It doesn't have to do with whether or not we cause other people to lust. Your sin is determined before you even walk out the door. We have to make sure that we give sound teaching on modesty. Part of the reason why, I was a little hesitant when Shackelford asked me to do this is because I think that in a sermon's probably the worst way to teach modesty. I don't know that getting up here and telling people how to dress is the most effective way to change it. I think that much more effective is how we teach it in our houses. And so for those of you that are parents, it is important that you prioritize this. They're not going to listen to me, but they will listen to you, parents. If you make this a priority in your household, then you can change. You can enforce these things so that you're raising children who aren't dressing the way they dress just because there's some kids at school that, why else would they not dress like them? You make sure you prioritize these things. If you don't focus on these things in your household, then you can't be shocked when they're just doing whatever seems right to them. It is your job to raise up your children and to instruct them. However, in some situations, people are not receiving this teaching in their household. If I go back to the Amish analogy I used earlier, I imagine the average Amish person isn't waking up, putting on her bonnet, and thinking, I'm going to make some people feel bad about themselves today. There are some people that were not taught correctly how to dress in their household. And so, how do we, as Christians, how do we try and help them? In our congregations, we have to have sound teaching. Now, that's involved in Bible class, but it's also involved with how we interact with each other. Titus chapter 2 tells us it is the responsibility of the older men to teach the younger and the older women to teach the younger. That's a responsibility. It is a commandment for those of us in this church that are good at these things. We have to instruct those younger brethren, because where else are they going to learn it? Now, I'll tell you, you need to come at, when you're teaching these things, again, come at them with love. Use love and wise decision-making in how you teach them. On the football team, there were two coaches that treated me very differently that are in the building tonight. If Coach Register were to come up to me and tell me I'm doing something wrong, I'm an idiot, it wouldn't be a big deal because he said that to me every day. Coach Hargett, on the other hand, If Coach Hargett would have ever said I did something wrong, I probably would have started weeping on the spot. All he had to do was come up to me and say, "Son, I'm disappointed." And I said, "You're right, I'm sorry, I quit." When Coach Register wanted to correct me, I was like, "Well, why do I care what you have to say? You're a meanie." But Coach Hargett, he tried to get to know me. He was nice, and I liked him. He never yelled at me. I made absolutely sure I didn't do something to upset Coach Hargett, because if he got upset with me, I couldn't handle it. And so make sure, if you're trying to teach people, if you're an older member trying to teach you younger brethren, make sure that you're being the kind of person they want to listen to. Make sure you love them. If the first word you ever say to someone is correction, if you've gone to church with them for years and you've never even bothered to say hi, to ask them how they're doing, then don't be shocked when they don't want to listen to you when you want to correct them. If we want to do what we're taught in Titus chapter 2, in our churches, we have to get to know each other. And especially for you older people, you have a responsibility to get to know the younger people, to help teach them so that they will want to listen to your wiser judgment. The young people, they're idiots. They need your wisdom. They need it bad. If any of y'all have ever gone on the internet recently, you agree with that. They need you. So make sure that within yourself, you need sound teaching and examining of how you dress. A lot of people, the reason they dress that way is it's honestly because it's just the way they were taught. They didn't really know any different. And so they just go throughout their life doing what they've always done until maybe they read the Bible and they start to realize that maybe it doesn't line up with Scripture. And so I just want to make sure tonight everyone examine this. Not just this, but how you act, how you speak, how you interact with people. Examine yourself. Make sure that what you're doing is glorifying your Father. Is immodesty only a problem for the young? I've been to the Green's house many times, and I'll tell you, in all of my trips to the Green's house, I've never once seen Rusty outside mowing the lawn in a pair of Daisy Dukes. Is that because Rusty is just so spiritually minded? Is it because he's the best of us and he's never once been tempted? Or is it because Rusty, like every man his age, is ashamed of his body? Once you get varicose veins, you're not tempted to wear short shorts. And so a lot of times the older members, we look at the younger members and we go, I don't struggle with that. Why don't you dress the way that I dress? And I think it can be hard because you don't understand that for younger people, this is a temptation that for many of you over the age of 30, you just don't have anymore. So does that mean you just strike them down and rebuke them and tell them just how foolish and wicked they are and how stupid it is what they're doing? Or do you understand that they might have a temptation that you haven't had in a long time? And you need to be understanding in the way you teach, in the way you instruct them. Make sure, for those of you that are younger, make sure that you listen to wisdom. I did just make fun of Rusty, but it's because I've heard Rusty probably teach more about modesty than anyone else in my life. He's taught it to numerous young children that, well, young guys at least, that there's a way you need to dress. It's important in the way you present yourselves. And just because Rusty or an older member doesn't currently struggle with that doesn't mean that they don't know what it leads to. If I see someone drinking alcohol, just because I'm not tempted to drink alcohol, I still know about what happens if you get drunk and you're hanging out at bars late at night. Just because I don't struggle with that sin doesn't mean I don't know what it leads to. And so likewise, if you're a younger member here, you need to understand that the older members here, they are a lot smarter than you. They are wiser. And there's times when they're going to see young people dressed a certain way, and because they're wiser, because they're older and they've seen more things, they know if you dress like that, it's going to cause certain problems. And so when they come to you and they try to instruct you, be understanding. Understand they are so much wiser than you are. And if they are coming to you, it is because they love you enough that they care about your soul. That a person here that, if not for this church building, if not for this group of people meeting together and loving God together, they wouldn't know you from Adam's house cat. But because of God, they're coming to you and trying to help you grow in your love for the Lord. And so, for the older, understand when you rebuke. And for the younger, listen, because they're wise and they know what they're talking about. To wrap up, modest dress glorifies God and not yourself. This would be the fun part of the sermon where I go to the Bible verse that has the entire list of all the clothes we're not allowed to wear. I'd read it to all of us, and then you'd all go home and you'd throw away your bikinis and go, wow, Nolan changed me tonight. But there's just not that verse. We don't have a verse with a strict list of all the things you should and shouldn't wear. And so make sure that you look at your heart. Make sure your heart is constantly focused on glorifying God and not glorifying yourself, because that's how we can tell. Listen to the wise members and be understanding of other people, and make sure that in everything you do, the way you dress glorifies God. It doesn't glorify yourself by showing off how attractive or how skinny you are. It doesn't show off how much time you spend in the gym. It doesn't show off how much money you make at work. But make sure that with the way you present yourself, you're always doing everything that you can to glorify your Father. So, how are you going to dress? I'm going to leave it up to you. I focused on the heart tonight because if I focused on more stuff, I'd be up here for 4 hours and you'd never ask me to be up here again. Look at your heart, examine it, and look to Christ. Look at the way he presented himself to the world and made sure that he wasn't a stumbling block to anyone, but instead he did everything he could to bring more people to heaven. I understand that a sermon about clothes, it's not a great one for getting a lot of baptisms. It's not the kind of sermon I'd give to people I've never talked to before. And so to try to give you something to, close with that's maybe a little less ticky-tacky, I've got one more verse about clothes. Isaiah 61, verse 10. I will greatly rejoice in the Lord, and my soul shall exult in my God. For he has clothed me with the garments of salvation. He has covered me with the robe of righteousness. I don't know why, but this verse always makes me think of the man found on the road who people were walking by and he'd been beaten up by this world, how life had left him for dead on the side of a road. But then Jesus saw him. Jesus saw him and he picked him up. He clothed him with the garments of salvation and the robe of righteousness, and he said, I've got you. I'm going to take care of you. Now that he's got these clothes, he's been once again restored because God has clothed him. God has saved him and given him everything he could possibly need. And so I'd just like to make sure each and every one of you know there's a final set of clothes each and every one of us put on. The garments of salvation and the robe of righteousness are the most important clothes each and every one of us own, and we can never take them off. If any of you have realized that you've begun to struggle, if you've become tempted to take off the garments of salvation and replace them with the things of this earth, you have an opportunity tonight with the people who love you the most to make it right again. If any of you need the prayers of the congregation, or you need to follow Christ down to his death and baptism, then please come forward as we stand and as we sing.